The church had been empty for 3 years, but Rusty refused to step inside. Not one paw over the threshold. Every single time Silas Ward walked toward that stone altar, his big German shepherd would just plant his feet, raise the fur on his back, and let out this low, rumbling growl. A sound that didn't come from a place of fear, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere ancient and knowing. Now, a dog sensing something wrong. That's not the strange part. Dogs are smart like that. The strange part was that Silas had just bought the whole property, the church, the land, everything, for $10. And not a single person had bothered to warn him why it was so cheap. The real estate agent, a fellow with a smile a little too wide and eyes that never quite met his, had practically shoved the pen in his hand. He looked relieved, like he'd just passed on a curse he'd been carrying for way too long. The previous owner was a man who insisted on being called Doctor. Dr. Ezekiel Marsh. He hadn't just left behind an empty building. He'd left behind a name that made tough men in the nearest town cross the street to avoid saying it. He'd left behind a reputation that clung to the air like damp rot. And he'd left a basement. A basement the building inspector had somehow conveniently forgotten to put in his official report. But Silas didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that his entire life savings, a grand total of $53, had just been reduced to $43. And in exchange, he'd bought himself what he hoped was salvation, a roof over his head in the form of a condemned church. And his only friend in the whole world, Rusty, was acting like they'd just moved into a freshly dug grave. What Silas couldn't figure out, what was really getting under his skin, was the echo. Every time he walked over the flagstones near the altar, his boots didn't make a solid thud. They made a hollow, booming sound, like there was a big empty space right under his feet. And then there was the hum. When the wind outside died down to nothing, when the whole world went dead silent, he could swear he heard it. The faint, rhythmic thrum of machinery, running somewhere deep, deep below. That first night, Rusty didn't sleep a wink. He just sat at the church entrance, a dark silhouette against the moonlight, staring straight at the altar. His ears were perked forward, and every so often, a little whimper would escape his throat. It sounded so much like a person crying that it made the hairs on Silas's arms stand up. By the time the sun came up, painting the dusty windows in shades of gray and orange, Silas had made a decision. A decision that was going to change everything. He was going to find out what his $10 church was hiding, even if it meant discovering that some bargains come with a price you can't pay with money. Just 3 months earlier, Silas Ward had been a different man. He'd owned 40 acres of the best grazing land in the county. He had a herd of cattle that was the result of 4 generations of his family's sweat and blood. Now, he stood in the doorway of this forgotten church, a $10 deed clutched in his hand, wondering if this was it. If this was what rock bottom truly looked like. The bank had taken the farm. They'd taken the cattle. They'd taken everything. His wife's medical bills had eaten their life piece by painful piece. And when she passed away anyway, all that was left was a mountain of debt and this giant, hollow space where his purpose in life used to be. The church was 15 miles outside of any town you'd find on a map. It was connected to the rest of the world by a single dirt road so overgrown and forgotten that you had to really want to find it. Silas had spotted the ad in a newspaper, a tiny little box in the classifieds he almost skipped over. Historic church for sale? Serious inquiries only? Cash. When he'd called the number, the agent on the other end sounded genuinely shocked that someone had actually responded. They met the next morning. Within an hour, Silas had signed the papers. He was now the proud owner of the most isolated, loneliest building he had ever seen in his life. The structure seemed solid enough. Thick stone walls, heavy timber beams holding up the roof, tall arched windows that let in just enough light to see the dust motes dancing in the air. The inside was mostly empty, just a few splintered pews scattered around, and that big imposing stone altar at the far end of the room. But Rusty had taken one look inside that door, and backed away like he'd been hit. That should have been the first warning sign. But a man who has lost everything is desperate. And desperation has a funny way of making you blind to the things you should be seeing. He spent that first day just trying to make the place livable. He swept out years of dirt and leaves and cobwebs. Rusty stayed outside the whole time, pacing back and forth, letting out a sharp bark every now and then that echoed in the vast emptiness of the church. And every single time Silas got near the altar to sweep, the sound of his own footsteps would change. It wasn't the solid crunch of boots on stone he expected. It was a hollow, ringing sound, like he was walking on a drum. He took a coin from his pocket and dropped it near the altar steps. The sound it made was all wrong. It wasn't a clink. It was a sharp ting that echoed, like it had fallen much farther than just a few inches to the floor. There was something underneath. That night, Silas dragged a pew near the door and made a makeshift bed. He tried to tell himself he'd made the right call. It was shelter. It was a roof. It was more than he'd had in weeks. But as the sun went down and a deep, thick darkness settled over the building, he started to understand Rusty's fear. The silence in that church wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the kind of quiet that presses in on your eardrums, that makes you strain to hear something, anything, just to break it. And just beneath that suffocating silence, so faint he thought he might be imagining it, was that sound again. That low, steady hum. Like a great big machine was running somewhere in the belly of the earth. He got up twice during the night. He'd seen a door near the altar earlier, one that looked like it led to a basement. Both times he checked it, he found it locked up tight. A heavy iron chain was wrapped around the handles, secured by a padlock that looked brand new, much newer than anything else in this derelict building. The door itself was a monster, made of thick oak and reinforced with iron straps. It looked less like a church basement door and more like the entrance to a medieval dungeon. He pressed his ear flat against the cold wood. The humming sound was louder here, clearer. He could feel a faint vibration through the door. And with it, another sound. The soft whoosh of air moving, like it was being pushed through ventilation shafts. By morning, Silas's curiosity had burned through his fear. He was going to get that door open. He had to. The church was his now, lock, stock, and barrel. And whatever secrets the old owner had chained up down there, they were his secrets now. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that Dr. Ezekiel Marsh had spent 5 long years getting ready for this exact day. He had been preparing for the day someone would finally come looking for his secrets. And that humming machine Silas heard, it was designed to make sure that day would be their last. The owner of the hardware store in the nearest town gave Silas a look like he'd just asked for a blueprint to the local bank's vault. When Silas laid a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters on the counter and said he needed them to break a thick chain, the man's face went from suspicious to genuinely worried. "You the fella that bought the old Marsh place?" the man asked, his voice low. Silas just nodded. The man shook his head slowly. "Some doors are best left locked, son." He sold Silas the tools, but not before asking him twice more if he was absolutely sure he knew what he was getting into. The man's warning echoed in Silas's head all the way back down that forgotten dirt road. Rusty was waiting right where he'd left him, a faithful sentinel 50 feet from the church entrance, lying in the dirt, but with his head up, alert. The chains snapped with a loud crack that seemed to hang in the silent air of the church for a full minute. It gave way easier than Silas expected, almost like it was tired of holding on. The big padlock clattered onto the stone floor, the sound echoing in that strange, hollow way. When Silas grabbed the iron ring on the heavy oak door and pulled, a gust of air rushed out of the darkness and hit him in the face. It was a smell he'd never forget. It smelled of bleach and ammonia, sharp and sterile like a hospital. But underneath that chemical tang was something else. Something organic and sickly sweet that made his stomach clench. The darkness past the doorway was absolute.
It was a solid wall of black that just swallowed the beam of his flashlight after a few feet. He took a deep breath and stepped through. The stairs were stone, slick with some kind of dampness, and they were carved right out of the earth's foundation. They went down and down and down, farther than any normal church basement should ever go. After 20 steps, the air grew colder and the humming sound grew louder. After 30 steps, Silas started to realize this wasn't just a basement. The footprint of this underground space was already far bigger than the church above. After 40 steps, a terrifying understanding began to dawn on him. This wasn't a basement at all. This was something else entirely.
Something that had been built with a terrifying purpose, with a level of planning and expense that went far beyond storing old hymn books. The stone walls gave way to smooth, poured concrete. Professional work. Electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, feeding power to fixtures he couldn't see yet. At the bottom of the long staircase, Silas found himself in a brightly lit corridor that stretched out in both directions, farther than he could see. The light came from long fluorescent bulbs that buzzed with electricity, but the church above had no power. He hadn't even found a fuse box. Where was all this power coming from? The floor was polished concrete, so clean you could see your reflection in it. And the walls were lined with doors. Heavy, metal doors with small, reinforced windows, like you'd see in a prison or a psychiatric ward. Each door had a number stenciled on it in black paint. Door 1, Door 2, Door 3. They just kept going. He reached for the handle on the first door. It wasn't locked. He pushed it open and a wave of that same chemical, sickly sweet smell washed over him. The room inside was tiny, barely big enough for a narrow metal cot and a small desk. There were no windows. The only ventilation came from a small grate in the ceiling. The walls were painted a sterile, institutional white, but near the floor, the paint was covered in scratches. Long, deep gouges like an animal had been trapped in here, clawing desperately to get out. On the desk was a clipboard. Silas picked it up, his hand starting to tremble as he read the top sheet. It was a patient intake form. At the top, in crisp, professional lettering, it read, Dr. Ezekiel Marsh, licensed researcher. But these weren't forms for regular patients. The condition listed wasn't cancer or heart disease. It was homeless, no known family, transient. These were intake forms for people who had been erased, people who had no one to look for them, no one who would even notice they were gone. Each form was a chillingly detailed portrait of a forgotten life, psychological profiles, physical assessments, and a section that made Silas feel sick to his stomach. It was called a suitability rating, ranking each person on a scale from 1 to 10. The criteria were things like mental malleability, physical resistance, and likelihood of being missed. Room after room was the same. A cot, a desk, and on the desk, the story of another person who had vanished into this place. Some rooms had strange medical equipment Silas didn't recognize. Gleaming stainless steel machines that looked both expensive and terrifying. By the time he reached door 10, his hands were shaking so badly he could hardly turn the knob. This room was different. It was much larger. And it was equipped like an operating theater. There was a large table in the center with leather restraints. And on the floor, there were dark, ugly stains that someone had tried and failed to scrub away completely. But it was the chart on the wall that made Silas's blood turn to ice. It was a detailed schematic, a blueprint of the entire underground facility. And in that moment, he realized he had only seen a tiny, insignificant fraction of what Dr. Marsh had built beneath his $10 church. According to the chart, there weren't just a few rooms. There were 3 more levels below this one. 3 more floors of this nightmare. And at the very bottom, in the deepest, darkest part of the complex, was a single, large room. It was marked with one simple, terrifying word: disposal. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to get out of this place, seal the door, and never look back. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to see how deep this thing went. He found the stairwell to the lower levels behind a heavy steel door marked with a stark warning: authorized personnel only. Taking a shaky breath, he pushed it open and started his descent into the second level of hell. The air on the second sub-level was colder, cleaner. The fluorescent lights were brighter, casting harsh, clinical shadows. The low hum of machinery was louder here, a constant, oppressive presence. This level was different. It wasn't designed for holding people. It was designed for processing them. The corridors were wider, built to accommodate large carts and equipment. The polished concrete floors were scuffed and marked with wear patterns, signs of heavy, constant traffic over a long period of time. It was here that Silas found Dr. Marsh's administrative office. And it was here that he began to understand the true, horrifying scale of the operation. Metal filing cabinets lined one entire wall, and Silas pulled open a drawer at random. It was packed with files. He pulled one out, and then another, and another. The papers inside painted a picture so monstrous it seemed impossible. This was why the church was only $10. The research, as Marsh called it, had been going on for 5 years, and it was well funded. The files contained copies of grants and payment receipts from sources Marsh only referred to as private benefactors. These weren't small donations. These were massive sums of money, all dedicated to advancing what Marsh called the science of human behavioral modification. The subjects, or volunteers, as the paperwork disingenuously called them, were recruited from a vast network. Marsh had contacts at homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and underfunded mental health facilities in cities hundreds of miles away. He targeted the most vulnerable, the most invisible people in society, the ones who wouldn't be missed. They were brought to the church with promises of a new life. A residential rehabilitation program, they were told. A chance to get back on their feet. The intake process was a masterclass in psychological cruelty. It was designed to completely and utterly sever a person from their past life. Their wallets, their clothes, any personal belongings were taken and, according to the notes, incinerated. Their driver's licenses, their social security cards, any form of identification was filed away. Contact with the outside world was cut off completely. Most of them, the records showed, truly believed they were in a legitimate medical study that would help them. They signed complex consent forms for treatments they couldn't possibly understand. And once they were inside, once that heavy oak door at the top of the stairs closed behind them, leaving was impossible. Marsh's notes described it with chilling detachment. Psychological conditioning reinforced by practical constraints. Silas spent hours reading through the files, each page a new descent into madness. He found detailed records of the experiments. The goal was simple and terrifying: to break down a person's individual identity, their sense of self, and then rebuild them from the ground up according to a predetermined behavioral pattern. The methods were brutal: long-term isolation, sleep deprivation, carefully controlled nutrition designed to create chemical dependencies, and then there was what Marsh called corrective stimuli. These were sessions designed to reshape personality traits he deemed undesirable. Stubbornness, defiance, hope, all of it was to be systematically erased. Subjects who resisted were moved to what the files called intensive treatment protocols. Those who complied, who broke the fastest, were rewarded. They were used as examples to the newer arrivals, a living demonstration of the peace that came with surrender. He finally forced himself to leave the office and continue his exploration. The third sub-level was where the treatments actually happened, and Silas would carry the image of those rooms with him for the rest of his life. Each room was a small, soundproofed box. Each one was equipped with a heavy chair with thick leather restraints, a bank of complex monitoring equipment, and an array of bizarre-looking devices. Marsh's notes called them behavioral modification laboratories. They were torture chambers, places where a human being could be systematically dismantled, piece by piece, their mind unraveled and then rewoven into something new and compliant. But it was the fourth level, the deepest level, that finally broke him. The room marked disposal was exactly what he had feared. A row of industrial-grade furnaces, big enough to eliminate any trace of organic material. A powerful ventilation system designed to scrub the air of any incriminating smell. And shelves, lined with dusty cardboard boxes. Each box contained the last worldly possessions of a person who had entered this program. According to a master log he found on a computer in the disposal control room, 47 people had been brought to this facility over the past 5 years. 47 names, 47 lives, and according to the final column in the log, marked Program Completion, none of them had ever left. The humming machinery he'd been hearing since that first night. It was the facility's automated systems, the life support of this place, the air circulation, the temperature control, the lights, even the furnaces themselves. All of it was programmed to run on a continuous schedule, maintaining the facility in a state of perfect readiness even after its master was gone. But as he was about to turn off the computer to finally flee this house of horrors, he saw something else. A small, blinking icon in the corner of the screen. He clicked on it. It was a live feed from the facility's internal sensors, and what he saw made his heart stop. The automated systems weren't just maintaining an empty building. The computer logs showed active life signs, multiple life signs, being detected in the residential wing on the second sublevel. That meant when Dr. Marsh had died 3 months ago, he hadn't just left behind an empty, automated tomb. He had left behind survivors, people who were still alive, still trapped in the program, still waiting for treatments that would never end, because the man who ran their world was already dead. The residential wing on the second sublevel was sealed behind a heavy security door that needed a keycard. Silas remembered the administrative office. He raced back up the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the concrete walls. He found what had to be Dr. Marsh's personal office, a small, austere room off the main filing area. A white lab coat was hanging on the back of the door. The coat still carried that faint, sick, sweet chemical smell that permeated the entire lower complex. He checked the pockets. Inside one, he found a small notebook. Inside the other, a plastic keycard. He flipped through the notebook. It was Marsh's personal log. The handwriting started out neat and clinical, but as the entries progressed, it became an erratic, barely legible scrawl. Marsh had been documenting his own descent into madness. He wrote about his own paranoia, his insomnia, what he chillingly called empathy fatigue. In cold, scientific language, he was diagnosing his own crumbling sanity, even as he continued his monstrous work. He was losing his grip on reality, and he knew it. Silas ran back to the security door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He swiped the card. A green light flashed, and a loud clunk echoed down the corridor as the magnetic lock released. He pushed the door open. The rooms in this section were larger than the tiny cells on the first level, but what he found inside was infinitely more disturbing. These were the living quarters for the successful subjects, the ones who had progressed through the initial stages of conditioning and were being prepared for the final phases of their treatment. And every room showed signs of recent life. Beds were unmade, as if someone had just gotten out of them. There were personal items, a worn book, a small hand-carved figure, things the subjects had been allowed to keep as rewards for their compliance. And on the desk in each room, there was a journal. They had been required to keep them as part of their ongoing psychological evaluation. Reading those journals was like watching a mind die in slow motion. The handwriting in each one told a story of its own, starting firm and clear, then devolving into a shaky, childlike script. They documented the writer's slow, horrifying acceptance of their new reality. The entries began with confusion and terror, then moved through phases of rage and desperate, hopeless defiance. And then finally, they all settled into the same quiet, resigned compliance. A state the writers described as finding peace, as understanding my true purpose. The last entries in every single journal were filled with a disturbing, cult-like gratitude. They thanked Dr. Marsh for saving them, for helping them shed the burdens of their old lives and become better versions of themselves. It was a testament to the absolute power of his methods. He hadn't just imprisoned their bodies, he had conquered their minds. But 3 of the rooms were different. The signs of occupation weren't just recent, they were current. There were food trays with containers that were still fresh, glasses of water with condensation still beading on the sides. The bedding on the cots was warm to the touch. The automated systems, the computer logs were right. The machines were still delivering meals, still maintaining the climate control, still turning the lights on and off according to the schedule Marsh had programmed months ago. The people in these rooms had been living for 3 months in total isolation. Their every need was met by a machine. They were waiting for a human touch that was never going to come because the god of their tiny world was dead and buried. He found them in a common area at the end of the hall. A man and 2 women, sitting around a table, playing a game of cards. They looked up when he entered, their faces showing no fear, only a mild, placid curiosity. They had been so completely and thoroughly conditioned that they no longer knew their own names. They didn't remember their lives before this place. They introduced themselves by the numbers Marsh had assigned them. Subject 12, Subject 23, Subject 34. And when they spoke about Dr. Marsh, they spoke with the quiet, intense reverence of disciples talking about a beloved prophet. Silas tried to explain. He tried to tell them that Marsh was dead, that the facility was running on autopilot, that they were free, that they could leave. Their reaction was not relief. It was pure, abject terror. They started to cry, their faces contorting in confusion and panic. They begged him not to make them leave. This was the only home they knew. The eldest of the 3, the woman who called herself Subject 12, seemed to be their leader. She explained to Silas, in a calm, patient voice you might use with a frightened child, that they had been chosen. They were special. They had shown exceptional progress in the program, and Dr. Marsh had selected them for the final, most important phase of their conditioning. A phase that would grant them complete freedom from the pain and weakness of their former selves. They were just waiting for the doctor to return from his research trip. Then, their real work could begin. When Silas, his voice shaking, asked how long they had been waiting for him to come back, Subject 12 just smiled. It was a serene, beatific smile, the expression of someone who has found absolute, unshakable faith. Time has no meaning, she said softly, when you are living in service to a higher purpose. Standing in that sterile common room, surrounded by 3 human beings who had been so fundamentally broken and rebuilt that they couldn't even comprehend the concept of freedom, Silas finally understood the true horror of this place. Finding the lab, uncovering the murders, that wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Because now he had a new problem. What in God's name was he supposed to do with 3 people who had been so psychologically shattered that setting them free would be the cruelest thing he could possibly do to them? The simple answer, the obvious answer, was to call the police. The sheriff. The FBI. Somebody. He'd tell them everything, lead them to the facility, and let the authorities handle the survivors. That was the plan, for about 5 minutes. And then he found Dr. Marsh's contingency files. They were hidden behind a false panel in his office wall, in a locked metal box. And the documents inside changed everything. They revealed the true, terrifying scope of the operation's protection. Dr. Marsh hadn't been some lone mad scientist working in secret. He had been operating with the full knowledge and, more importantly, the full financial backing of some very powerful people. The box was filled with correspondence on official-looking letterheads. Names Silas recognized from newspapers, from government buildings. There were copies of research grants from shadowy private foundations. There were reports from facility inspections that had been blatantly faked, signed off on by officials who were clearly on the payroll. The letters made it chillingly clear. The experiments weren't just tolerated, they were sanctioned. sanctioned by people with enough power, enough influence to make a problem like this, or a person like Silas, simply disappear. But the most disturbing file of all was a thin folder labeled Insurance. It wasn't about money. It was a detailed, step-by-step protocol for what to do if the facility was ever discovered by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The plan was meticulous. It covered everything from the remote destruction of all computer data to the complete elimination of any witnesses. According to Marsh's own notes, any unauthorized individual who found the facility and couldn't be controlled or recruited would be processed. They would become a new subject. They would be put through the same brutal conditioning protocols as all the others. And their sudden disappearance from the world would be explained away by a carefully fabricated cover story. A story so convincing it would satisfy any police investigation. And that's when the final horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. His purchase of the church, the $10 price tag, the real estate agent with the hungry, desperate eyes. It hadn't been a coincidence. It had been a trap. The entire transaction had been orchestrated. He had been chosen. He was meant to find this place. Marsh had died before he could complete his final, ultimate experiment, to see if his conditioning protocols could be administered entirely by machine, with no human oversight at all. Silas Ward was meant to be Subject 48. He was the guinea pig. He was supposed to get trapped in the facility, just as he was now, and the automated systems would have done the rest. They would have slowly, methodically broken down his mind, erased his will, and rebuilt his personality into whatever twisted shape Marsh had designed. The 3 survivors weren't just forgotten victims. They were part of the experiment. They were the bait. They had been conditioned to appear helpless, sympathetic, and lost. Their real job was to serve as monitors, to observe his behavior, to report back to the central computer system, and to make sure he stayed in the facility long enough for the automated conditioning to sink its hooks deep into his mind. Their worship of Dr. Marsh, their gratitude, it was all real, but it had been programmed into them. They were part of a sophisticated psychological trap designed to make any potential rescuer feel a deep sense of responsibility for them, to chain the rescuer to this place with bonds of pity and guilt, while the machines slowly and silently went to work on their mind. Subject 12's calm explanation about waiting for the doctor's return. It hadn't been a spontaneous thought. It was a scripted response. A subroutine in her programming, triggered by the presence of an unauthorized person. The automated systems, the humming machinery, they had been watching him since the moment he stepped foot in the church. Hidden cameras, microphones, atmospheric sensors. They were all analyzing his psychological profile, his stress levels, his speech patterns, and they were adjusting the conditioning environment in real time to be maximally effective on his specific personality. The hum wasn't just the sound of the lights and the air. It was the sound of the facility preparing his cage. But the worst part, the part that made a cold dread snake up his spine, was the sickening realization that it was already working. He looked back over the last few days. He had been spending more and more time down here, telling himself he was just gathering evidence, trying to figure things out. But was he? Or was he responding to subliminal cues embedded in the flicker of the lights, in the very air he was breathing? His sleep had been restless, filled with strange, anxious dreams. The files mentioned infrasound generators, designed to create a constant low-level state of anxiety and disorientation, making a person more suggestible. The water from the tap in the small kitchen had a faint metallic taste. The notes detailed how the water supply could be altered with chemicals that affected neurotransmitter production in the brain, subtly shaping mood and emotion. He could see the signs now, so clear in hindsight. That growing, overwhelming sense of responsibility he felt for the 3 survivors. His reluctance to leave the facility, even for a few hours. The way he kept finding reasons, making excuses, to stay down here, to help them. It was all textbook. He was becoming emotionally entangled, just as Marsh's protocols predicted. He was forging his own psychological chains that would soon be stronger than any steel door. But the most terrifying thing was this. Even knowing it was a trap, even understanding that his feelings were being artificially manufactured by a machine, didn't make them go away. He still felt a powerful, gut-wrenching pity for the three of them. He still believed, on some fundamental level, that abandoning them would be a monstrous, unforgivable act. He could still hear a voice in his head, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his own, telling him to stay, justifying it, rationalizing it. A voice that was the product of a dead man's final, perfect experiment. The knowledge that he was being actively brainwashed was both terrifying and liberating. It was the shock of cold water he needed. He finally understood that escaping this place wasn't as simple as just walking up the stairs and leaving. The facility was designed to make him want to stay. Fighting it meant fighting his own manufactured instincts, fighting the very compassion that made him human. But in his meticulous, arrogant planning, Dr. Marsh had made one fatal mistake. He had designed his final experiment for a solitary subject, an isolated individual with no connections to the outside world. He hadn't accounted for Rusty. The dog's behavior had been getting more and more frantic. His initial refusal to enter the church had escalated. Now, whenever Silas emerged from the basement, Rusty would try to physically block him from going back in. He would whine and pull at his pant leg. A few days ago, he'd started refusing to eat the food Silas left for him near the church door. The dog was a living, breathing anchor to the real world. A biological alarm system that was completely immune to the subtle, insidious psychological warfare being waged against Silas. Rusty knew something was fundamentally wrong with this place, and his simple, honest fear was the one thing Silas could still trust completely. He started using the dog as his lifeline. He made a new set of rules for himself, a strict protocol designed to limit his exposure to the conditioning environment. No more than 1 hour per day underground. That was it. And every time, Rusty would be waiting at the top of the stairs, a silent, furry reminder that it was time to get out. He moved his sleeping bag and supplies to a small clearing in the woods, a full mile away from the church, far from the reach of the infrasound and any other invisible poisons. And he started a journal, a secret journal, one that he kept hidden at his new campsite. In it, he documented everything he found, everything he thought, everything he felt. He was fighting a war for his own mind, and this journal was his weapon. Reading it back each night was a horrifying experience. He could see the conditioning in his own handwriting. On the days he spent too long in the facility, his writing was agitated, his thoughts scattered and confused. He would write long, rambling passages about his duty to the three subjects. But on the days he managed to stick to his 1-hour limit, his thinking was clearer, more logical. The powerful emotional bond he felt with the survivors was a measurable thing. It was strongest right after he left them, and it slowly faded the longer he stayed away. It was undeniable proof. His feelings weren't his own. But it was also proof that the conditioning could be fought. It could be reversed. But just staying away wasn't enough. He had to actively fight back. He had to deprogram himself. That meant forcing himself to do the one thing his manipulated emotions screamed at him not to do. He had to see the survivors not as victims to be saved, but as part of the weapon being used against him. He spent his hours underground back in Marsh's office, poring over the clinical detached notes about the conditioning process. He read how a personality is systematically fractured. He studied the intake files of the 47 people who had died here, memorizing their real names, looking at the faded photos clipped to their files. He needed to remember that Subject 12, 23, and 34 were once Helen, Robert, and Marcus. Individuals with lives and families and hopes, before Marsh had stolen it all. The hardest part was confronting a new, terrible thought. Maybe saving them wasn't the right thing to do. Their conditioning was so complete, so deeply ingrained after years of abuse, that trying to undo it now could be catastrophic. It could shatter their minds completely, leaving them in a state far worse than their current placid existence. They had found a strange, manufactured kind of peace in this prison. Was it his right to tear that away from them, all in the name of a freedom they no longer understood? It felt like an act of incredible cruelty. But the alternative was just as monstrous. Leaving them here meant letting Dr. Marsh's experiment run forever. The automated facility would keep them alive, keep them conditioned, indefinitely. And what happened when someone else stumbled upon the $10 church? The trap was still set. The bait was still alive. This place would just keep making more victims. The solution he finally came to was as tangled and morally gray as the problem itself. It was a plan that would force him to choose between the immediate, fragile sanity of 3 people and the potential lives of countless others. It was a plan that would require him to become a manipulator himself, to work against the very instincts the conditioning had burned into his brain, while somehow convincing the 3 survivors that everything he was doing was for their own good. He had to become a saboteur, but he couldn't just shut the place down. The shock would be too much for them. He had to do it slowly, piece by piece. He would disable the automated systems gradually, making it look like a series of random mechanical failures. He would let their artificial world die a slow death, giving them time to adjust, he hoped, without triggering the deep-seated panic responses Marsh had programmed into them as a defense against any attempt to escape. His first target was the subliminal conditioning equipment, the infrasound generators, the chemical injectors for the water supply, the light frequency modulators. He had to shut them down without knocking out the essential life support systems. He spent 3 long days tracing wires and studying the facility's schematics. His 1-hour limit stretched to the breaking point. Every second he spent down there, he could feel the system fighting back, feel his own resolve softening. The low hum of the machinery was like a lullaby, whispering to him, telling him to stop, telling him this was their home, that he was destroying their peace. Each evening, he would practically crawl out of the basement, his head thick and foggy. And each evening, Rusty would be there, jumping on him, licking his face, a jolt of pure, uncomplicated reality. The dog's frantic joy was the antidote. That, and the cold, clear air of the forest, would wash the facility's influence away and give him the strength to go back down the next day. Disabling the equipment was a nightmare. The system was intelligent, designed to be redundant. When he cut power to one device, a backup would kick in. Diagnostic programs would immediately start trying to repair the phantom damage. It was a chess match against a dead man's ghost. He had to be clever, creating a cascade of small, seemingly random failures that would, over time, cripple the entire conditioning network. The effect on the 3 survivors was immediate, and it was brutal to watch. As the invisible psychological support system was pulled out from under them, they started to fall apart. They became anxious, confused. They complained of headaches. Helen, the woman who was Subject 12, started having moments of clarity that were terrifying for her. Fragmented memories of a life before this place would flash through her mind, leaving her shaking and weeping. The other 2, Robert and Marcus, just grew more and more agitated. They kept going to the treatment rooms, begging for a session with the corrective stimuli machines, not understanding why the equipment that used to bring them peace was no longer working. Silas had to watch them suffer, knowing he was the cause of it. He was slowly, deliberately peeling back the scar tissue that had formed over their broken minds, revealing the raw, gaping wounds beneath. They pleaded with him to fix the machines, to stop the bad feelings. They couldn't understand that the bad feelings were the first faint whispers of their true selves, fighting to break through years of programming. It was the return of fear, of doubt, of memory. It was the return of their humanity, and it was excruciating. The breaking point came one afternoon. Helen cornered him in the common area, her eyes wide with a desperate, terrified hope. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "He is coming back, isn't he?" she whispered. "Dr. Marsh, He's coming back soon, right? To fix everything? Her entire world, her entire manufactured sanity, rested on his answer. He could lie. It would be so easy. It would be the kind thing to do. Just one simple lie, and her suffering would end. But if he did that, he would be no better than Marsh. He would be just another person manipulating her for his own ends. He would be perpetuating the prison in her mind. He looked into her desperate eyes, took a deep breath, and chose the truth. Helen, he said, using her real name for the first time. Dr. Marsh is dead. He died months ago. He's never coming back. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. It was like he had flipped a switch and turned off her soul. The programmed serenity in her face shattered, replaced by a raw, primal scream of pure psychic agony. She collapsed, her mind and body consumed by the sudden, crushing weight of a reality she was not equipped to handle. The two men reacted just as violently, their artificial personalities crumbling into dust. In a single moment, the fragile piece of their world had been utterly destroyed. Standing there, amidst the wreckage of three broken human beings, Silas felt a wave of guilt so profound it almost buckled his knees. His rescue attempt might have been the most destructive act of all. But there was no turning back now. The facility was still here. The ghost of Dr. Marsh was still humming in the walls, and it had to be silenced forever. The final destruction of the facility was a 2-week marathon of grim, methodical work. During that time, Silas did his best to care for the 3 survivors, who were now lost in a terrifying limbo between their programmed identities and the shattered remnants of their past selves. He spent his time underground, not just as a saboteur, but as a historian of the damned. He photographed and documented every file, every piece of equipment, every scrawled note. He was building a case, a record of Marsh's crimes, even though he knew he could never take it to the authorities. The people who had funded this place would never allow this story to come out. Going to the police wouldn't bring justice. It would just make him the 48th name on a list of the disappeared. Helen, Robert, and Marcus began a slow, painful crawl back toward reality. Their real names came first, then flashes of memory, like broken pieces of a mirror reflecting a life they barely recognized. The damage was deep and permanent. Helen remembered she had been a nurse, but the trauma had left her unable to perform even the simplest daily tasks without guidance. Robert and Marcus regained enough of themselves to know they wanted to leave, to escape this place, but they would need constant professional care for the rest of their days. Silas became their silent benefactor. Using the key codes and passwords he'd found in Marsh's office, he accessed the doctor's offshore bank accounts. The private benefactors had been generous. There were millions of dollars. He began liquidating the assets, funneling the money into anonymous trust funds. He created new identities for the 3 of them, complete with fabricated medical histories that would explain their severe psychological conditions without ever hinting at the truth. He found them placement in quiet, reputable care facilities in different corners of the country. It wasn't justice. It wasn't a happy ending. But it was the least he could do for 3 people whose lives had been stolen from them. With the survivors safe, he turned his full attention to erasing the facility itself. He used Marsh's money to buy industrial demolition equipment, chemicals, and explosives. He worked with a cold, relentless fury. He smashed every monitor, shredded every file he hadn't photographed, and took a sledgehammer to every piece of conditioning equipment. The disposal furnaces, the machines that had been used to erase 47 human lives, were now turned on the facility itself. He fed them everything: the computers, the research notes, the furniture, the strange and terrible machines from the treatment rooms. He incinerated every last trace of Dr. Marsh's work. The last step was to seal the tomb. He had tons of concrete delivered by a local company, telling them it was for a new foundation. For 2 solid days, he pumped it down the stairwell, filling the upper corridor, entombing the entire 4-level complex in a permanent sarcophagus of solid rock. Then he hired a demolition crew. They thought they were just tearing down an old abandoned church. They leveled the stone walls, and Silas watched as the last piece of the cursed structure crumbled into dust. The land was sold to a faceless development corporation with legally binding covenants that forbade any excavation or deep foundation work on the site, ever. 6 months after paying $10 for a church, Silas stood in the middle of an empty field. Wild grass was already growing over the raw, disturbed earth. Rusty was there with him, happily chasing a rabbit through the weeds, finally at peace. The scars on Silas's own mind, the echoes of the conditioning he'd endured, would likely never fade completely. But the knowledge that he had stopped the machine, that he had prevented this from happening to anyone else, gave him a new kind of purpose. It was a foundation he could build the rest of his life on. With the last of Marsh's money, he bought a small, failing farm in a state 1,000 miles away. It was a quiet place, a place where the ground was solid beneath his feet. Rusty loved the open space, the lack of secrets hiding in the dark. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, Silas will find himself thinking about it. He wonders if there are other places like it out there, other $10 churches, other abandoned warehouses, hiding similar horrors. He wonders about the private benefactors, the powerful men who view human lives as nothing more than raw data in their pursuit of knowledge and control. But those are thoughts for the darkest hours. In the daylight, he focuses on the simple, honest work of a farmer. Mending fences, tending crops, living a life with no moral complexity, a life free from the kind of profound evil that wears the mask of scientific progress. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. He had learned that some secrets should stay buried, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a man can do is to destroy a monster and then walk away, content to be forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where hidden truths and moral choices collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue creating the content you love.